Economic Democracy by Major C.H. Douglas, Chapter 5. Looked at from this standpoint, it is fairly clear that the kernel of the problem is factory cost, since it is quite possible to conceive of a limited company in which the shares were all held by the employees, either equally or in varying proportions according to their grade, and the selling costs were internal, that is to say, all advertising was done by the firm itself, and the cost of its salesmen, etc., was either negligible or confined to their salaries. We should then have the complete profit-sharing enterprise in its ultimate aspect, and the argument against capitalism, in its usual form, would not arise. Such an undertaking would, let us assume, make a complicated engineering product, requiring expensive plant and machinery, and would absorb considerable quantities of power and light, lubricants, etc., much of which would be wasted, and would inevitably produce a certain amount of scrap, the value of which would be less than the material in the form in which it entered the works. The machinery would wear out and would have to be replaced and maintained, and generally it is clear that for each unit of the production there would be three main divisions of factory cost: the staple raw material, the wages and salaries, and a sum representing a proportion of the cost of upkeep on the whole of the plant, which might easily equal 200% of the wages and salaries. As the plant became more automatic by improvements in process, the ratio which these plant costs bore to the cost of labour and salaries would increase. The factory cost of the total production, therefore, would be the addition of these three items: staple material, labour and salaries, and plant cost, and with the addition of selling charges and profit, this would be the selling price. As a result of the operations of the undertaking, the wealth of the world would thus be apparently increased by the difference between the value of all the material entering the factory and the total sum represented by the selling price of the product. But it is clear that the total amount distributed in wages, salaries, and profit or dividends would be less by a considerable sum, representing purchases on factory account, than the total selling price of the product, and if this is true in one factory, it must be true in all. Consequently, the total amount of money liberated by manufacturing processes of this nature is clearly less than the total selling price of the product. This difference is due to the fact that while the final price to the consumer of any manufactured article is steadily growing with the time required for manufacture, during the same time the money distributed by the manufacturing process is being returned to the capitalist through purchases for immediate consumption. But we know that the total increase in the personal cash accounts in the banks in normal times is under 3% of the wages, salaries, and dividends distributed. Consequently, it is not to these accounts that we must look for effective demand. There are two sources remaining: loan credit, that is to say, purchasing power created by the banks on principles which are directed solely to the production of a positive financial result, and foreign or export demand. Now, loan credit is never available to the consumer as such, because consumption as such has no commercial value. In consequence, loan credit has become the great stimulus either to manufacture or to any financial or commercial operation which will result in a profit, that is to say, an inflation of figures. An additional factor also comes into play at this point. All large-scale business is settled on a credit basis. In the case of commodities in general retail demand, the price tends to rise above the cost limit because the sums distributed in advance of the completion of large works becomes effective in the retail market, while the large works, when completed, are paid for by an expansion of credit. This process involves a continuous inflation of currency, a rise in prices, and a consequent dilution of purchasing power. The reason that the decrease in the consumer's purchasing power has not been so great as would be suggested by these considerations is, of course, largely due to the intrinsic cheapening of processes which would, if not defeated by this dilution of the consumer's purchasing power, have brought down prices faster than they have risen. There are thus two processes at work: an intrinsic cheapening of the product by better methods, and an artificial decrease in purchasing power due to what is in effect the charging of the cost of all waste and inefficiency to the consumer. And it is clear that under this system, the greater the volume of production, the larger will be the absolute value of the waste which the consumer has to pay for, whether he will or no. Because as the bank credits are created at the instance of the manufacturer and repaid out of the prices each article produced dilutes, by the ratio of its book price to all the credits outstanding, the absolute purchasing power of the money held by any individual. These facts are quite unaffected by the perfectly sound argument that increased production means decreased cost per piece, since it is the total production price which has to be liquidated. Already there is not very much left of the argument for the innate desirability of unlimited, unspecified, and intensified manufacturing under the existing economic system. But more trouble yet is ahead of it. While the ratio of plant charges to total wages and salaries cost is less than 1 over the whole range of commodities, a general rise in direct rates of pay may mean a rise, but not a proportionate rise, in the purchasing power of those who obtain the remuneration in this way. But when, by the increased application of mechanical methods, the average overhead charge passes the ratio of 1 to 1, which it rapidly will and should do on this basis of calculation, every general increase in rates of pay of direct labour may mean an actual decrease in real pay, because the consumer is only interested in ultimate products, and overhead charges do not represent ultimate products in existence. The whole argument which represents a manufactured article, no matter what its description and utility, as an access of wealth to the country and to everyone concerned, so long as by any method it can be sold and wages distributed in respect of it, will, therefore, be seen to be a dangerous fallacy, based on an entirely wrong conception which is epitomised in the use of the word production and fostered by ignorance of financial processes. Manufacturing of any kind whatever, even agriculture in a limited sense, is the conversion of one thing into another, which process is only advantageous to the extent that it subserves a definite requirement of human evolution. In any case, it shares with all other conversions the characteristic of having only a fractional efficiency, and the waste of effort involved, although being continually reduced by improvements of method, still can only be paid for in one way, by effort on the part of somebody. If this effort is useful in the sense that a definite healthy, and sane human requirement is served, the wealth and standard of living of the community may thereby be enhanced. If the effort is aimless or destructive, the money value attached to it does not alter the result. The financial process just discussed, therefore, clearly attaches a concrete money value to an abstract quality not proven, and as this money value must be represented somewhere by equivalent purchasing power in the broadest sense, misdirected effort, which appears in cost, forms a continuous and increasing diluent to the purchasing value of effort in general. Now, it has already been emphasized that, at the moment, economic questions are of paramount importance, because the economic system is the great weapon of the will to power. It will be obvious that if the economic problem could be reduced to a position of minor importance, in other words, if the productive power of machinery could be made effective in reducing to a very small fraction of the total man-hours available, the man-hours required for adapting the world's natural resources to the highest requirements of humanity, the deflation of the problem would, to a very considerable extent, be accomplished. The technical means are to our hands. The goodwill is by no means lacking, and the opportunity is now with us. But it should be clearly recognized that waste is not less waste because a money value is attached to it, and that the machinery of remuneration must be modified profoundly, since the sum of wages, salaries, and dividends distributed in respect of the world's production will buy an ever-decreasing fraction of it. It is one of the most curious phenomena of the existing economic system that a large portion of the world's energy, both intellectual and physical, is directed to the artificial stimulation of the desire for luxuries by advertisement and otherwise, in order that the remainder may be absorbed in what is frequently toilsome, disagreeable, and brutalizing work, to the end that a device for the distribution of purchasing power may be maintained in existence. The irony of the situation is the greater, since the perfecting of the organization to carry on this vicious circle carries with it, as we have just seen, a complete negation of all real progress. The common factor of the whole situation lies in the simple facts that at any given period the material requirements of the individual are quite definitely limited. That any attempt to expand them artificially is an interference with the plain trend of evolution, which is to subordinate material to mental and psychological necessity, and that the impulse behind unbridled industrialism is not progressive but reactionary, because its objective is an obsolete financial control which forms one of the most effective instruments of the will to power, whereas the correct objective of industry are twofold: the removal of material limitations and the satisfaction of the creative impulse. It is for this reason that while, as we see, the effect of the concrete sum distributed as profit is overrated in the attacks made on the capitalistic system, and is of small and diminishing importance as compared with the delusive accounting system which accompanies it, and which acts to reduce consistently the purchasing power of effort, it is, nevertheless, of prime importance as furnishing the immediate inducement to produce, which is a false inducement, in that it claims as wealth what may be just as probably be waste. If by wealth we mean the original meaning attached to the word, i.e. well-being. The value in well-being to be attached to production depends entirely on its use for the promotion of well-being, unless a case is made out for the moral value of factory life, and bears no relation whatever to the value obtained by cost accounting. Further, if the interaction between production for profit and the creation of credit by the finance and banking houses is understood, it will be seen that the root of the evil accruing from the system is in the constant filching of purchasing power from the individual in favour of the financier, rather than in the mere profit itself. Having in view the importance of the issues involved, it may be desirable to summarize the conclusions to be derived from a study of the methods by which the price of production is based on cost under the existing economic arrangements. They are as follows. 1. Price cannot normally be less than cost plus profit. 2. Cost includes all expenditure on product. 3. Therefore, cost involves all expenditure on consumption, food, clothes, housing, etc., paid for out of wages, salary, or dividends, as well as all expenditure on factory account, also representing previous consumption. 4. Since it includes this expenditure, the portion of the cost represented by this expenditure has already been paid by the recipients of wages, salaries, and dividends. 5. These represent the community. Therefore, the only distribution of real purchasing power in respect of production over a unit period of time is the surplus wages, salaries, and dividends available after all subsistence, expenditure, and costs of material consumed has been deducted. The surplus production, however, includes all this expenditure in cost, and consequently in price. 6. The only effective demand of the consumer, therefore, is a few % of the price value of commodities and is cash credit. The remainder of the home effective demand is loan credit, which is controlled by the banker, the financier, and the industrialist in the interest of production, with a financial objective not in the interest of the ultimate consumer. It will be necessary to grasp the significance of these considerations, which can hardly be overrated in its effect on the breakup of the existing economic system, in order to appreciate the result of a change in the control of credit and the method of price fixing, with which it is proposed to deal at a later stage. The administration of credit. It is this view of the entire industrial problem which, in our opinion, makes the policy of the Whitley Councils wholly vicious. It is just conceivable that under favourable conditions, which, perhaps fortunately, do not exist, some arrangement might be evolved to deal with the questions of unemployment and poverty under the capitalistic system. Although the considerations which contribute to the inadequacy of the policy of superproduction seem to suggest almost insuperable difficulties in the way of the achievement of even this very modest result. But granting the bare possibility, it could only have the effect of making the individual, no matter what his position in life, still more the absolute slave of a competitive system, the social results of which are demonstrably unsatisfactory, and that if it is conceded that this is a valid objection, It is clear that there is every reason to resist the attempt to bolster up a thoroughly outworn conception of society in its industrial embodiment, after congratulating ourselves that we have defeated and disposed of its military and political aspect. But the scheme of industrial councils to control industry is also open to criticism on quite other grounds. The modern business is not to any considerable extent an undertaking run on capital, it is run on credit. The claim for representation made by capital is really a claim to represent the administration of credit. We hold very strongly the opinion that the administration of credit is not a proper field for private enterprise, not because we have any predisposition to collectivism, but by reason of the clearly social origin of credit itself and the impossibility of limiting the sphere of influence exercised by any manipulation of it. The mandate of its self-appointed representatives is therefore open to a fundamental challenge, and it will be well to decide whether it is in order, before conceding to the delegates the moral weight of its immense potentialities for good or evil.